And I think it's really exciting for churches that have an existing expression now, where as younger people are experimenting with other expressions. I think Soul Revival was a great example of how people can have two kinds of expressions happening within the context of being one family.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is great to have you along with us, and we're really excited to be meeting again because I have Tim Bilhartz. How are you?
G'day, Joel. I'm doing really well.
Excellent. And Stu, as usual, how are you?
Hello, Joel.
Feeling well?
Yes, I am, thank you.
Excellent. We are still talking about engaging the youth and youth culture with the church, and this time we are going to have a look at the strategic approach. We've been breaking down the 4 views of youth ministry, Mark Center's book, and looking at those different ones. So we have the strategic approach today. But before we do that, Tim, cultural artifact, please, as we like to throw out every so often, or almost every episode we're doing right now. So what would you say your cultural artifact is that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, cultural artifacts. So we're thinking about the 90s. We're thinking about youth ministry in the 90s. I was in high school for the late 90s, and so my favourite style of music during that time was the kind of the new punk scene and skater punk. So bands like The Offspring, Blink-182, MXPX, the Vandals, those kind of bands. And in the Australian scene, one of the big ones was The Living End. We're kind of riding that tide. And so their kind of breakout single was, I now can't think of the name. We Don't Need No One to Tell Us What to Do.
Yeah,
because we're on our own,
called? Okay,
and there's nothing we can do.
Keep going, I'll look it up.
And the name will come to Joel very soon.
Yep.
But that, I think, really defined that punk movement and a lot of the energy that punk had even in previous incarnations of punk, with the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and others in earlier decades, where there's a rejection of the old, and as a youth culture, we're going to be doing our own thing. We don't need your voice. You don't take us seriously anyway, so why should we listen to you? We're going to go off and do our own thing. And so that was very much kind of the spirit of punk and that kind of era, which was great. I don't know if I necessarily resonated with that spirit of it, but it was really fun music style. I think we talked about a couple of episodes ago when you were talking about the anger of the new metal scene that I never quite got into, but there was this sort of a fun and silliness to the punk scene at that time. And so, yeah, very hedonistic, just enjoy life, just go out and lots of skating and surfing, moshing, just a lot of sort of frivolity. But that spirit of the young people, just we can just do our own thing. We don't need you as an older generation to tell us what to do. Is going to feed into our strategic
prisoner
approach.
of society.
Prisoner of society, thank you.
That's what it was called. Are they still recording?
I don't know if they're still recording. I don't recall any official breakup. I don't know if I'm not sure when their latest release was.
It's always funny, there's a lot of, those bands that are just have this cultural significance, but then they break up. Stu, one of your favourite bands, the Beatles, obviously broke up at some point. Was that a sad day when you learned about the causes of that? Oh yeah,
the Beatles is probably one of the most famous breakups in history, I suppose. Did Yoko Ono break up the Beatles? That's the big, still the unresolved question.
Oh, what would you say?
I think
yes,
that played a part.
Very large part.
Do you know any good breakup stories?
Oh, my favourite one is one of my favourite ones is there's a recording of the Eagles playing on stage, and they're all just. Two especially are just saying to each other how much they're going to kill each other after the show.
Kill each other?
Yeah, they're just going, I'm going to smash you or something. I can't remember exactly what they said, but I think they obviously weren't too happy with each other. I was pretty sure. And then there's things like Pink Floyd, how they never talk to each other anymore. But one of my favourite bands of the Darkness have had a breakup and a reformation. So they recorded 2 albums, but in between the first and the second album, because they hit massive success, especially in the UK. Even recorded a Christmas single, which is pretty funny.
The Darkness recorded a Christmas single?
Yeah, it's called Christmas Time, Don't Let the Bells End.
Okay.
So they almost got number 1, were beaten out by someone like Mariah Carey or something like that. But yes, the lead singer, who is one of my favourite frontmen of all time, got quite hooked on cocaine and also taking a lot of laxatives to make sure he stayed thin on stage. So eating really badly, taking a lot of cocaine, and then taking a lot of laxatives to make sure he didn't get too fat.
That doesn't sound like a good recipe.
No. So then after the second album, I ended up going to rehab.
Okay.
And also broke up the band by dating the manager they kicked out the bass player because he was dating the manager and they'd agreed not to, but the bass player had the most amount of problems with it, so he was the one that was kicked out of the band because they had to keep him. Wanted to keep the singer on because he's like one of the key parts with his falsetto voice and all that kind of thing. So, and then 5 or 6 years later, they get back together after, like, because they're two brothers in that band, and they got back together after playing on stage once with playing a Queen song or something like that. So it's funny how volatile artists are.
It's like Oasis, isn't it? They had a pretty good breakup as well.
Two brothers who got real
vocal.
problems with each other.
Yeah.
And very public breakup. Yeah, very similar, Oasis to The Darkness. Like, they hit massive success in the UK and then had a lot of issues going on after that. But I don't think Oasis are back together anymore.
No.
I think they just perform solo.
Yeah, I think they still hate each other.
Yes. I know that Liam Gallagher likes to talk a lot about Manchester City, his football team.
Okay.
They're just like, oh, let's go talk to Liam Gallagher. He knows a lot about football. Anyway, onto the strategic approach. Tim, do you want to give us a summary of what the strategic approach is? It's Mark Center actually writes that in the book. Is that right?
Yes, this is Mark Center's own approach. So he's the one who sort of collates all the different approaches in this book. He's the general editor of the 4 Views, and so he's got his other 3 mates who are pitching different approaches. But Mark Center's own approach is the strategic approach. Essentially, what he's advocating for is that a youth minister disciples a group of youth, gets the youth leaders around that, and they form an intentional community of discipleship. And as they grow up, purposefully don't grow into the church that they were formed from, but actually split off and go off and create their own unique church. What he's trying to respond to is a few things we've talked about on the podcast and we can tease out. One is this homogeneous unit principle, where you have you split up the different ages and the different segments, and you minister directly to them. So he's saying that's a reality, and so as we minister to youth, we need to recognise that that's going on. Also, the inability sometimes of the older members of a church to accept youth and to listen to youth. So we've talked a lot about how in the shock absorber approach, we are trying to intentionally listen to young people and let them influence us as they hit the shocks of culture. They then disseminate those shocks throughout the church, but that comes from having youth connected to the church and connected to the world, and also the established church who are genuinely listening to the young people. That sort of doesn't enter his framework, but what he's saying is that we have this reality where the older church, the car, I suppose, in our model, is not going to listen to the shock absorbers. They're not going to listen to the young people. And so it's better for the young people and a community around them of leaders and young adults to go off and do their own thing and to start their own reality. So that's where he comes from. He says a few sort of famous things I think we've referred to previously on the podcast, things like, no one takes you seriously in church until you're at least in your mid-30s or older. And so you end up with this situation where you've got a homogeneous group of teenagers who are graduating out of youth group, meant to assimilate into the larger congregation, and yet the larger congregation doesn't give them the time of day and doesn't listen to them, doesn't give them a voice at the table until they're in their mid-30s. And so that becomes frustrating for young adults, and so they leave. So what he's trying to respond to is, we don't want the older teenagers and young adults to leave our churches, obviously. We want them to stay connected with Jesus. We want them to grow as members of his church. And so, but if we have this reality where they're not going to be taken seriously in the large church, maybe the best thing for them is to actually continue to grow up into a community where they don't leave. They don't need to graduate, but they also have a significant voice.
Okay. When you first read that chapter, what is your initial reaction to that? Does it sound like it's a good idea, or is it more just we need to continue the homogeneous unit principle until we can possibly stop it working?
Yeah, it's interesting because in one sense he is admitting that the homogeneous unit principle is a reality, and this reality of the inability of the institutionalized church to listen to young people. And he uses a number of examples from the rock and roll era, from the Jesus people, from even in sort of the 80s as well, of the formation of churches like Willow Creek and others, as examples of where this has worked really well. But then he also kind of pitches the idea that this new group, that splits off, will itself become an intergenerational church. And so he's kind of got this vision for something that, beautiful, this intergenerational reality, and yet he thinks the only possible way that can happen is if the initial group buds off from the initial church.
It kind of breaks away.
And splits off. Now, in his approach, he sort of pitches the idea that everyone's on board with this. So the mother church, as he says, is for this idea. They actually recruit a youth minister who wants to grow and bud off this system. So the whole church is in on the plan, but you've got this perpetual cycle of budding off new congregations from the youth communities that are growing up. So it's an interesting tension in the chapter that he's got between sort of realizing that there's certain cultural elements to the church that you just can't change, and also wanting to create new realities. And so that's an interesting tension that he has throughout his chapter.
In that model, what ends up happening to the existing church? Because if you're going to keep budding off, does that mean we're just waiting for that, like, not to put too fine a point on it, to die off?
In one sense, yes. I mean, he doesn't answer that directly in the chapter, but he does talk about how we're often too tied to the idea of church being in a particular location, a particular building. And so he's trying to free church from that. He wants to see the church as the gathering of the people. But if you have this reality where there's an older generation who are wanting to stay tied to a particular building, particular location, then you let them be. I guess you end up with a place where in 2 or 3 decades' time you might not have a church there because everyone has grown up and died off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we can talk about, like, the church isn't a building, is it? But I thought it was interesting also you talking about how it's just a given that the younger people in the church aren't going to be listened to. I was going to ask both you guys a question. Stu, you might want to start. Why don't we listen to young people? As a society, I suppose.
Yeah. I think, excuse me, Mark Center does make that point, Joel. He says that short of a revival, you've got to move with culture, he reckons, which I disagree with. Like, I think that we can be countercultural within our culture. And so that's a point where I disagree with the argument. But he is very good at showing how, as Tim was saying, that churches aren't listening to young people. And I think if you track it back, there's always been a sense that, particularly within Christianity, that the older generation passes on the wisdom to the next generation. And when you read in the scriptures, there's lots of encouragements for us to continue to pass on the gospel to the next generation. I think what can muddy the waters a little bit is sometimes people pass on the gospel message in their cultural form to the next generation. I think that's where the problem comes. So that works okay if the culture doesn't change. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, the culture stayed the same for hundreds of years. So each generation was having the gospel passed on in the same cultural format. But what starts to happen in the Industrial Revolution is technology means that new innovations mean that people live different ways. So each new technological advancement means that each new generation get used to living in a different way. And so as technological advancement increases, people become increasingly different to the older generation that was around before. So in the Industrial Revolution, people lived in villages and worked on the land, and there was cottage industries. And within a generation, everyone was moving to the cities, into these massive big factories, and technology was replacing people in farms with steam-powered tractors, and in the factories, people were just now feeding these huge factories. So the technological world had meant that a new generation were living differently to the previous generation. So the difficulty for that generation was, how do we pass on the gospel to this new generation that are living differently? And that problem only increases as technology increases. So the Industrial Revolution continues as long as there's technological change. So if you fast forward right up until our era, I grew up in a time where, let's take telephones for example. I lived in a house with one telephone with one telephone number, and everyone used to have to share the phone. And we didn't even have an answering machine when I was growing up. So if my friends rang me and I didn't answer the phone, that was not a big deal. So they'd ring me, I wasn't there, I might be out somewhere. They'd try and ring me, but it was like, oh, I'll see if I can get my friend on the phone. And if I can't, it's no big deal. So either you ring back or you leave a message with mum. So you get home sometimes and there's a little piece of paper with a message, oh, ring so-and-so. Oh, okay. But the other thing was that if someone rang me and they didn't get me, they'd say to themselves, oh, I'll just talk to Stu tomorrow at school. So there's no big deal. Now, fast forward to now, people text you and expect a response straight away, or a phone call response straight away, or a message app or Snapchat or whatever it is. So the disconnect for me is sometimes younger people ring me and I think, oh, I'll get back to them tomorrow because that's what I grew up with. But then they get frustrated with that because they expect me to get onto it straight away. But their higher expectation of communication is just because they've got better technology. So what Mark Center is saying is very real. There's a very real disconnect between people who grow up with different technologies. And the problem is that if I was going to try and impose the culture that I developed around the technologies that I grew up with on this new generation with these new technologies, well, they would find it very difficult to take on my culture. If you look at it within the context of our gatherings or our services, the way we form our expression of church is some of the elements of that are theological and biblical, but some are strategically cultural. So some of the cultural expressions we have are actually things we pass down to young people as well. And what Mark Center's saying is sometimes older generations get wedded to their cultural expression as much as they are to the gospel itself. And sometimes we find it really hard to distinguish what is our cultural expression from the era we grew up in and what is our actual, the gospel, ancient gospel message that never changes and is relevant in any generation. And so what we've tried to do with the shock absorber is say, let's think through our theology. Let's put the cross at the center of who we are, and then let's work out what strategic theories we might use to help create a culture that expresses that, and then what is our practice of discipleship and mission within that. And so our practice can be a bit flexible because our strategy can change a bit without changing the gospel. So we've gone to a lot of extent within the shock absorber model to try and say the gospel message doesn't change, but our expression can. Now, a lot of churches, Centre argues, are not like that. So what we're saying with the shock absorber is we need to listen to young people and listen to their cultural expression as well as share our cultural expression and have a mix of both so that we can move forward together in discipleship and mission practice, keeping the gospel message the same. Centre's arguing that people who grew up in the 50s had traditional forms of Christianity, and then after the youthquake in the 60s, young people didn't relate to those forms. One really good example is that people would dress up formally to go to church in the 1950s and wear shirts and ties and cut their hair short as a sign of piety. And that was considered to be a very godly expression of a Christian. Now, a bunch of hippies turn up to a church in 1968 in San Francisco, and they come to the door of, I don't know, let's say the First Presbyterian Church in, I don't know if there is such a thing in San Francisco, but I'm just making this up. And they go to this church and they rock up to the church. It's just an imagined scenario here. And they're all dressed in caftans and beads and got long hair and jeans, and they look, very different. And here at the door are two welcomers dressed in a suit and tie and a lady with a really lovely formal Sunday best dress on. There's a very good chance that these hippies coming up to the church could have been turned away at the door by people saying, how about you go home and get dressed properly and then come back to church? Now that is a very authentic expression from this older generation. And, a lot of guys in the 60s, older guys who'd fought in the Second World War for their country, found it real difficult to relate to young men who grew their hair long, because they thought that was really ungodly, and they shouldn't have long hair. So these sorts of questions are in every generation. For example, one modern example is, should we let kids be on their phones during church service? Now, for me, that's not cool for someone to have a phone and scrolling through social media while they're in church. But for young people who are always on their phones, maybe that's not so disrespectful. I don't know. I'm not having an opinion here. I'm just giving you an example that my cultural expression, where I just had a telephone in my house, I feel free to just communicate with people one-on-one when I see them next. Young people are talking to people who's to say they might not be sharing the gospel message they're hearing from the sermon with someone outside of the church while they're listening to it. So I've got to be careful I don't just judge them by my cultural expression. So this creates a huge amount of different points to discuss, and Centre says that's too hard. Let's not worry about it. Let's let the old people have their suit and ties in the church, and let's let the hippies go and start a Jesus commune. And that's what they did. Literally, the young Christians in the 70s with the Jesus movement left the established churches because it was too hard for that conversation to take place. The hymns and the liturgies of the established mainline churches were not relevant to that rock and roll generation, and they wanted to express their Christianity through rock and roll and through music, guitars and drums. And in the initial stages of that youthquake in the 60s, Mark Centre saying, well, the hippies just went and started hippie Christian communes. They did this in Sydney. There was a place called a commune called the House of the Purple Door and the House of the Gentle Bunyip. All these cool hippie kind of little churches sprung up for young people. So what Centre says is, well, that's what they did in the 60s to solve the cultural expression problem. Why don't we institutionalise that now and start churches with young people? But rather than it being an argument where they argue and split, let's actually build that into the model for adults who don't want to change their expression and sort of grow their young people up to send them out. So they're almost being sent out as missionaries to their generation in their cultural expression. Now, I think we can do better than that. And, when I first read about that, which I'll talk about later, but when I first read that in the 90s, I thought that was the opposite of what we're trying to do in Soul Revival by remaining at Guymer Anglican Church. But we'll come back to that later. But I think Mark Centre's argument is very clever because he's seeing detail that often Christians don't talk about. So we often don't talk about those cultural expression differences. And we talked about the preparatory approach a couple of weeks ago. That assumes the young people will just take on the cultural expression as well as the gospel. And I think a lot of churches in Sydney where we live think like that. Yeah, the young people will just live like us with our expression.
It is a fascinating thing, whether it's in church or in wider society, that we've grown up with our certain cultural experiences and all that kind of thing, and then we see a younger generation going through something different or expressing it in a different way, and we're like, well, that's not what I had. So, but it's funny that that's the weird thing, Tim, I think, is that it's such an easy temptation to go, they don't understand me, I don't understand them, let's just not worry about it. Like, it almost sounds like Centre's saying, don't bother with it, don't bother frustrating, and just turn the next page kind of thing. But I feel like we're missing something in that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so I think, as Stu said, he has noticed a reality, and he's turned that noticing of a reality into an actual model for ministry. So we talked a few weeks back about the homogeneous unit principle, that just started as an observation from a ministry point of view, from a missionary point of view, that the people ended up going to churches with people who were like themselves. And so the first people that were writing about the homogeneous unit principle were just kind of noticing a reality. But that noticing reality then turned into an actual model. Oh, well, if this is happening, maybe we should strategically do that. We should intentionally try to pitch particular gatherings, particular churches, particular services at particular demographics because we've noticed that it works, therefore we should take that on as a model. It feels a bit like Centre's doing the same thing. He's noticing the youth quake, he's noticing the Jesus revolution, he's noticing that there is a frustration that happens where young people are growing up and not being welcomed by the institutional church are going off and starting their own realities, whether it's the hippie communes, whether it's the Gen X churches of the 80s, whether it's the sort of the emergent church type things of the late 90s. he's noticing that that's happening, and has turned an observation into a prescription, that this is maybe what we should intentionally plan to do. But yeah, I mean, part of the reason that I'm passionate about an intergenerational approach is that I do think we miss something there. The older generations are missing out on understanding Christ better as Lord and Saviour by not being able to see that there might be authentic discipleship happening with young people who have different cultural expressions. And the young people are missing out by not hanging out with the senior saints, by actually realising that actually you can be a faithful Christian by having older and different types of cultural expressions. So an intergenerational church, an all age, all stage, which is seeking to purposely bring those generations together and say, okay, you've got cultural expressions, you guys have instant messenger and Snapchat and ways that you expect to be communicated with, and you've got people who grew up with a single telephone, and you've got senior saints who have, even the telephone was, sort of a different technology. You've got all of those coming together.
Morse code,
carrier pigeons. But you've got, when you bring them actually all together, it helps you to notice that cultural expressions are not the gospel. That actually Jesus' death and resurrection, the kingdom that he brought in, the life that we are called to live under his discipleship, that is the gospel. That's what we have in common. And that is true for those in our churches who are 90 and 9. And when we have that as our unifying feature, then it's okay to just then sit and notice that there are different cultural ways of expressing that, and to learn and grow through difference. I was having a conversation yesterday with a couple of people just talking about the difference between sort of agriculture and permaculture. I don't really know that much about farming, so I may be completely butchering this image. But my understanding, the way I was using it was, when agriculture, you've got one particular crop, and you might have, acres and acres and acres just growing corn. And that, an abundance of corn you can grow when you're specialising in that. Whereas a permaculture is intentionally growing different types of plants, all within close proximity with each other. And what you actually find is that you may get a bountiful harvest in the short term with particular agricultural crops, but there is payoffs that you actually lose nutrients in the soil and all sorts of other things that come in. You're more susceptible to blights and to insects and pestilence and all those kinds of things. Whereas a permaculture, because there's lots of different plants growing all together, they're feeding the nutrients in the soil in different ways. They're actually feeding off each other in different ways. And so there's actually something that comes from having difference there that is really beautiful. And so, taking that to the church context, yes, it is sometimes really difficult for teenagers to understand what's going on with the middle-aged Gen X adults who have very different cultural expressions and have different understandings of how you faithfully worship Jesus, how you faithfully come to church and express your discipleship. But that, I think, centres kind of noticing that and saying, don't try to bridge that gap. Allow the younger people to go out, bud their own service and do church in culturally appropriate ways, culturally expressive ways. And that allows the Gen Xers or the boomers before them to worship God and have authentic discipleship in their culturally expressive ways. And so while it allows that approach, my argument and our argument would be actually maybe there's something beautiful that can happen when you bring those together, not to diminish either culture, but actually to allow both of them to coexist in a permaculture type way.
I've got to say, you guys are killing it with the analogies at the moment. We've had stir fries, and then we've got permaculture versus agriculture. So that's really, really cool. I like that idea, and I like the idea of that we're talking about as like when we embrace difference, as we've said before, that's when we actually start, like, our discipleship and mission is strengthened by doing that. But what I was interested in was, we were talking about Centre saying we need to, like, perhaps bud that church out of the youth ministry or the younger generation. Is he trying, I think you might have said, Stu, he's trying to institutionalize that section of the church. But we've talked about before, the institutionalizing doesn't really work very well. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so my view is that I think he's looked at what the hippies did with the Jesus movement, and he's also looking at, say, Willow Creek, which started as a youth group, and then the youth group went and started their own church in a movie theatre. I think when they first started, they became one of the biggest attractional ministries in the world, and they became incredibly influential. So but interestingly, that church seemed to be very successful with baby boomers, but then the following generation, Gen Xers, didn't relate to that baby boomer movement as well, which is interesting. So Centre's sort of institutionalizing that whole idea that maybe it's a good idea for young people to keep starting new churches in each generation, which is, I think in a way, it's the necessary outcome of the homogeneous unit principle, because the first stage of the homogeneous unit principle is let's start different church services for different age groups. And he's just taking it one step further and saying, instead of starting a youth group for the next generation of youth, raise them up with a youth minister to send them out and start a new church for them. And you see in the 2000s that became a very common model for church planting in the 2000s. There's a lot of talk about Mars Hill at the moment with Mark Driscoll. There's a new podcast that's come out called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Well, when Mars Hill came out, I personally saw Mars Hill as a Centre's model, which is let's start a church for young adults of young adults to young adults. And so just let's have a target age group that we're going to start a church to. And a lot of the church planning that came out of Acts 29 and other models was actually driven by church planning to young hipsters. And so all these hipster churches started. But that wasn't even the beginning of it. There was a lot of the emerging churches in the late 90s were doing that. And I think there's a lot of pressure on us even when we were at our age at Guymer Anglican Church to leave and go and do something different somewhere else, because all my friends left Guymer Anglican Church to go to other churches or start their own things. And some of my friends from university went along to some of the emerging churches. There was a church in Newtown, I think it was called Cafe Church. And so some of the Cafe Church crew said, oh, you guys, this is back in the 90s, they were looking at what we were doing with Soul Revival after we did stay at Guymer, and we were doing Soul Revival at Guymer to stay at Guymer. So we were a new expression at Guymer of youth ministry, but we kept going to the evening service. We invited our elders to come along to our gathering on a Saturday night too. Some of our crew used to go to the traditional service in the morning. We were trying to say that we can have our cultural expression as young people, but we're still part of the big family at Guymer Anglican Church, and we were committed to stay. And right back earlier in the early 90s, I had a conviction to stay at Guymer Anglican as long as I could, and my wife and I said, unless we get asked to leave, we're going to stay at Guymer. And Soul Revival was growing at Guymer, and we ended up staying at Guymer for 20 years, which was really exciting. So we were kind of the opposite of the Centre model. We were trying to stay within the church and continue to have that conversation that we're talking about, even though it could be hard sometimes. We stayed to have the conversation. But some of my friends from Cafe Church were saying, Soul Revival's amazing. You should start your own church and start Soul Revival. And that was back in the 90s. People were putting pressure on us to think about starting. But we didn't want to do that because we didn't want to leave our elders. So the church planning impulse back in the late 90s and then 2000s was for young people to have a young person's church. But if we did that, we wouldn't have our 80-year-olds. And I remember one night we had at Soul Revival where we asked a retired doctor to come along and give us a talk on sexuality, and he came along and talked about. Back in the day, we called it, a Rello bash, where we had all the elders come and hang out with us. And Dr. Bonamy just shared some of his wisdom from the Word of God about how God had designed us as sexual beings and how He wanted us to actually express that. And it was just a really powerful moment as young and old were listening to each other. So he didn't come in with some moralisms and say, this is what you have to do, and impose his cultural expression on young people. He was talking about the biblical realities that we all sit under, and we did that together. Now, if we'd have left and become the trendy church plant to the young generation, we would have missed out on that night. And so what we tried to do at Guymer Anglican with Soul Revival was stay within the context of Guymer. We were Christians first, and we're Guymer Anglican second, and then we were part of Soul Revival third. And that community idea was that we had an opportunity to be. Now, there were some compromises we made as a result of that, but they made compromises too. But that's also really beautiful. So one of the things that the church wanted us to do was continue to have an evening service that was for younger people. So we had a intergenerational expression on Saturday, and then we went to the Sunday evening service. And then the church encouraged the young families, even though we all hung out with teenagers on a Saturday night, they encouraged the young families to go to the morning contemporary service, and we did that. So if we were our own church, we wouldn't have gone to those homogeneous expressions, but we did for the sake of staying at Guymer Anglican Church. And I think it's actually quite amazing we stayed together with those two cultural expressions for 20 years. That's like half of my life I stayed as a youth minister at Guymer, but I'd grown up for another 20 years part of that church too, and it's my home church. And so I spent 40 years at Guymer Anglican Church, and it wasn't until the church said that they wanted to go in a different direction with the youth ministry and not have that intergenerational youth ministry that we thought it would be time to Matt and I were the leaders of Soul Revival, and we thought it was time to resign then. But it wasn't. Matt and I didn't have any animosity towards that because we'd had such a wonderful 20 years together. But what we also thought was we wanted to be listening to our elder generation and our leadership. And when our leadership wanted to go deeper into the homogeneous unit principle, I think it was great to then say, we've had a really great experiment for 20 years with staying together, and it was a very different kind of leaving than. The church didn't grow us up to leave because we were a different expression. We grew up together in that context. And I think it's really exciting for churches that have an existing expression now, where as younger people are experimenting with other expressions. I think Soul Revival was a great example of how people can have two kinds of expressions happening within the context of being one family. And when you think about it, that's what our families do. I mean, my boys listen to different music than I listen to. They have different lifestyles than I listen to, but we all live in the same house. And I watch different movies, and my boys laugh at me when I've got a Western on, and they're like, oh, there's Dad watching a Western again. Like, Elijah doesn't care about Westerns. And then, Elijah laughs at me for wearing my Billabong shirt, and he's walking around in his champion clothes or whatever, and he's wearing his different styles, and we're all in the same family. So I think rather than starting a church for different styles, we can actually have a church of different styles.
So you'd rather keep the band together than break it up?
I think that's a great way of expressing it. Rather than letting those differences drive us apart, let's actually try and use those differences to help us to become more creative for as long as it works for both of us. I mean, it's not something we have to push no matter what. I mean, in the end, I think as we left Guymer Anglican in 2010, we didn't take all the young people with us when we left. Like the centre argument is all the teenagers and all the youth leaders go and start a new church. When we did leave, and we were invited to church plant by the bishop and E&C actually asked Guymer Anglican if they would be okay about gifting this new church plant a launch team of 30 people. And the launch team of 30 people, some were youth leaders, some weren't. And as Guymer Anglican were very gracious and said, yeah, that'd be fine. When 30 people approached us, we went back to the church and said, well, these 30 people have approached us. Are you okay with that? The senior minister said, yeah, those people are fine. And as I talked with the senior minister about leaving, we talked about shoring up the youth ministry before I left. And so when we left, our launch team from Guymer Anglican only had one teenager. It was my son, Ethan. And we decided not to start a youth group for a couple of years until Guymer Anglican established. And when I left, we had at least 100 teenagers on the roll who were staying at Guymer Anglican. And I rang around 30 people who were willing to stay on as youth leaders at Guymer Anglican. So there was a healthy youth ministry that stayed, and we started a new church, not two young people by young people, but we wanted to have two strong churches. That was our hope. So even as we left, we weren't doing the homogeneous unit strategic approach. We were planted as a daughter church from our mother church at Guymer Anglican, but it was not the centre's approach, and it wasn't the trendy church planting approach at the time, which was to plant a young adults church to young people. So that's where Soul Revival is different. There are benefits for having churches that are aimed at certain demographics, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that it's very exciting, as Tim says, to have some farms that are growing corn and some farms that are permaculture. And so I like the diversity of different approaches existing within the same broader church as well. So just as in a local church, I think we can have different diverse cultural expressions. I think amongst the church planting community, we can have different kinds of church plants. And so Soul Revival isn't just the only way to church plant. It's just another example. We're all age, all stage. Some churches are to a certain demographic.
Tim, did you want to add to that? Sorry, I thought you were giving me the eyes. You wanted to add
something
on top of that. One thing that I thought worth teasing out too is the way that we focus on the atonement theology. I feel like when you talk about theology, strategy, and practice, we say we don't change our theology. I feel like that perhaps is a key part that is possibly missing from the strategic approach. What do you think? Because we talked about that we are almost planting they are almost planting in the strategic approach because we just need to be like what the culture says. But I think when we talk about atonement theology, that transcends it, as you were talking about earlier, Tim. Do you guys want to tease that out a little bit more?
Yeah, I don't think in the strategic approach in that chapter in the book that they talk explicitly about a theological framework for it, Tim. I don't know, do you?
I'd have to go back and read it carefully. I don't remember, though. My recollection is that it's primarily coming from, when you talk about theology, strategic practice, it's the strategy that is really leading there rather than a deep reflection on theology. And so because it's the strategy that it's driving, and so in that way it's the sociological realities, I guess, in one way that is driving his approach. So seeking to respond to that in a really helpful way, which again is not to say that it's sub-Christian or anything like that. Like he's wants deeply formative Christians who are reaching out missionally to the world and preaching the gospel of Jesus. So there is theology there within it. But in terms of actually how do you do church, it is the sociological realities which are really driving the strategy.
And I think Mark Center and Pete Ward would come from that incarnational theological framework that says that Jesus became a Jew to the Jews, and so let's start church missionary endeavours to people in their culture, in their context. I think that incarnational theological framework would probably be partly driving it.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I thought that again, as maybe we try not to frustrate people, like the last chapter. What was it? The missional approach that frustrated you. What would you say to people again that are thinking, we're in the homogeneous unit principle. We want to change things. We want to take more of an intergenerational approach. We don't want to be a strategic approach and take everyone out of the church and leave. What would you guys suggest would be some ways that if someone's wanting to pursue that in terms of their ministry, what could they start doing in terms of getting an idea about maybe generating some momentum behind an intergenerational approach?
Yeah, I think my first thought would be that it's low-key, long-term and relational. Like we did at Guyam Anglican, we were there for 20 years ministering together, and it's about the relationships that you can build together as you actually put the one another passages from Scripture into practice. You bear one another's burdens, you encourage one another, you build one another up, and creating spaces within your church for people to come together and connect. I think food is a great way of doing it. The old way of doing it in churches was a thing called the fellowship tea in the Anglican church in my growing up, and that just meant that after church on a Sunday morning, everyone would bring something like a cut sandwich or a little meat pie or sausage rolls, and there'd be all these plates, and they'd be all put down on a big trellis table, and the whole church would come together and have lunch together, and everyone would take a bit of. These days, I don't think all the health concerns would allow that exact expression. But there you go again. That's an old expression. But in some ways, I think the cut sandwich has helped me stay a Christian through my teenage years, because I used to love going to church for a fellowship tea, for a cut sandwich. Little chicken sandwich and cut in a little triangle. I used to love those. And while you're standing there with your paper plate and your cup of cordial and your cut sandwich, and you're talking to an older person, you're finding out about what they think about Jesus. And those conversations about faith, I think that's the first step, having places where we can have conversations. So if a church has, a morning service, a traditional morning service, a contemporary family service, and a youth service, maybe some kind of bringing together for a meal all those different people. But Tim might have some more thoughts. So I think starting simple anyway is what I would argue, and giving it time to grow. But what do you think, Tim?
Yeah, well, I was reflecting on the fact that when we allow our theology, particularly the theology of the atonement, to be driving our strategy and our practice, that allows us to hold loosely to our own cultural artefacts, our cultural expressions. And so it might be that the example you used before, having a paper Bible in front of you is really important. Actually, I don't know if there's a way in which you can be genuinely Christian and have your phone on while you're watching the service, because who knows what you're doing. You could be flicking through Facebook completely tuned out, or you might be actually tweeting or Snapchatting your friend about the great point that the preacher just made. I was just super encouraged by this. Those of us,
you might be reading an electronic Bible, I suppose, if you're super onto it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
or getting into a commentary.
But so there's there's different cultural forms, but when we're allowing our theology to shape, that we can hold those loosely, and we can go with a curiosity. And so when I'm preaching and I see someone on their phone, that my immediate instinct, because that's not my generation, is to assume that they're disengaged. But it might be that they're really engaged. I don't know. But holding loosely to my own cultural preferences, I can go with a genuine curiosity and say, hey, how'd you go with the service today? I noticed you flicking on your phone. And not in a judgmental, like I'm coming down to crack down on you, but just a genuine curiosity of what do you find that helpful? And also it might help me to realise that my preaching style is not engaging to a particular demographic or age group. And I go, oh, okay, so if they're humble enough to say, oh, actually I found you a bit boring, and I found it really hard to concentrate, I can then again hold that loosely and say, okay, are there things that I can do different? Like can you help me as a preacher change? Can you help me shape the way that I'm presenting? Is there something I can be doing better? Would it be helpful if I had more visuals on the screen? Would it be helpful if I added some more elements of this? Would it be helpful if I provided like the tweetable little sentence that you could then send out to your friends? How can I be shaped by that? So we're looking for ways to accommodate to each other. There's a great chapter by a guy called Gareth Crispin, who's a UK guy who's interested in intergenerational ministry. He writes a chapter in a book that's all about the importance of accommodation, which is where those who are older actually set aside their own preferences, come down and listen to the younger voices. And likewise, you're helping to train these younger people to accommodate to the older ones as well. But like Paul talks about with the older and the stronger and the weaker brethren, it should be the emphasis on the older, more mature saints to be the ones who are able to set aside their own preferences to allow the younger expressions to come through. And so it might be the older, mature saints. I certainly go back a generation when I was coming through as a young adult or teenager. The older generations at church would find it really frustrating to wear a hat in church, and that could cause a big issue because for them, the cultural expression, it was dishonouring to how special church was to wear a common variety hat to church. And so
men shouldn't have their head covered. They take that and apply that as a hat, a baseball hat in church.
Yeah. And so that would be confronting to them to have that cultural expression. But when we have, we're focused on the atonement as being the way in which the framework which we see church happening and ministry happening, when we're able to be accommodating to each other, the hope is that a mature saint will look and see a hat that's frustrating and go, oh, I find that really disrespectful. But rather than rousing on the teenager, we'll just come and genuinely engage with them and be able to hold that cultural expression with loose hands. But then in the conversation they have with me, maybe I realise, maybe I am offending them. And because I can hold my cultural expression with loose hands, maybe it's okay for me to choose not to wear a hat and leave it in the car, or park with my skateboard outside the church or whatever it is. But that's something that we need to continue to embed in the culture framework and the teaching that we're doing, and doing that explicitly, really clearly communicating those kind of accommodations to all generations. So we don't want to separate out cultural expressions. We don't want to separate out generations, but coming together does provide that mixture, and it's going to there's going to be some compromise, there's going to be some accommodation, and there's going to be things that I personally am not passionate about, but for the sake of my brothers and sisters in the church, that it's okay, because actually it's not the cultural expression, it's not my personal preferences that are the gospel.
What do you reckon, Stu?
Yeah, so you don't need to start a church for people who wear baseball caps and a church for people who don't wear baseball caps. But it can be a really difficult conversation, because I remember the first time I wore a baseball cap in church, one of the wardens came up behind me and clipped me on the back of the head while I was sitting in the pew and took my hat off, and he said, "I'll give this back to you at the end of the service." So that set up in me a bit of tension and a bit of, I didn't like the way I got treated there. But he was also thinking, I don't like the way you treated me, because you didn't even talk about that. You just walked in with your hat on. We live in a beachside suburb. Some kids come straight from the beach to church on a Sunday night, and they've got sand on their feet, and they walk in with bare feet, and that's considered to be disrespectful, as much as the hippies walking into a church with long hair. In fact, the principle behind this too is, do we make moral decisions or decisions based on love? And sometimes we make a moral decision that you never wear a hat, or you have to wear shoes, and we make that a rule, and then all the young people have to learn all those moral rules. Well, that's one way of doing it. But then the way Tim just expressed that was using love as a principle, which is, I really love you, I want to work with you on this. And you see it in scriptures too, like when Paul takes Timothy to Ephesus, he had Timothy circumcised. Now that's really interesting, because Paul had been writing to all the churches saying you don't have to get circumcised to be a Christian. But when he takes Timothy to Ephesus to get circumcised, isn't he actually contradicting his own principle? Well, he's not really, because what he's doing is he's thinking, if Timothy, who's a Gentile, goes to this congregation uncircumcised, we'll spend the whole time talking about circumcision. And he wanted to go and talk about the gospel. So he said, Timothy, let's not worry about having this big argument about circumcision. Let's get you circumcised so it's not an issue, and we can just get on with the gospel. And that's a loving decision rather than a moral decision, to explain that a little clearer. Like, you can see this worked out in history. For example, you can see it even on a world stage. Well, like when Second World War happened, Winston Churchill, who was the leader of England, said that all Nazis are bad and anybody who fights a Nazi is good. That's a moral statement. Now, the problem with that is, in post-war world, some of the things that Stalin was doing in communist Russia was just as authoritarian and just as terrible as what Hitler was doing. So he had labelled the communist regime good before and during the war, because, well, not before, but during the war, because they were fighting the Nazis. So everyone who fights a Nazi is good. Well, actually, no, that doesn't work, because after the war, these communists were killing their own people. Like, something like 30 million people died at the hands of their own government. Like, that was dreadful. You see the same thing in the war on terror. President Bush said all terrorists are bad and anyone who fights a terrorist is good. That's a moral statement. But then when you look at the uprising in Chechnya, well, are they freedom fighters or are they terrorists? It's a bit hard to do that. So love actually gives us a better paradigm to work with, rather than making these moral statements about, well, this is how I express my Christianity, this is my moral position on phones in church, and you will actually not bring your phones in church. And I know some churches where they have a basket and people have to put their phones in the basket when they come into youth group. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea, it might be a good idea, but I think that can tend towards being a moral statement, that using a phone is bad and not using a phone is good. But what if there's a young person who's got all of their notes in their online Bible and all their highlighted passages on their online Bible in YouVersion, and by putting the phone in the basket means they can't actually take notes in church, and they're actually taking notes on their phone. Now, I'm not saying every teenager who uses a phone in church is on notes. There's some doing Candy Crush, there's some playing Clash of Clans, there's some on Snapchat. I know that's the downside of that, but to actually take love as a principle rather than a moral statement. One last example of that is I had really long hair in the 90s, as most of my friends did. And when I first started being friends with Aboriginal people out in Western New South Wales in Brewarrina, I went along to an Aboriginal community, and the Christians in that community said, how can you be a Christian and have long hair? Because the Bible says that a man with long hair is shameful. Now, my response was, well, what is long hair? How long is long hair? But we had this big debate the first weekend I went out there about hair. And then I came back home, and a very wise Christian elder said to me that story about Paul and Timothy going to Ephesus. And I thought it would be less dramatic to cut my hair than Timothy having to get circumcised. So for love and for the gospel, I had my hair cut, and I got a short haircut so that next time I go out to Brewarrina, we didn't have to talk about the theology of hair. We could just get onto the gospel and we could all talk about that, because I was coming in under their leadership, and I was actually wanting to participate in the mission they already had going in Brewarrina. And as a servant, I wanted to serve my elder Ike, who was going to be leading me, and so we could talk about the gospel. Now, some of my friends in Sydney said, oh, you don't have to compromise, that's terrible, you don't have to cut your hair, and they wanted to have that argument. And I just didn't think it was a meaningful, relevant thing for me, because I think I was working on that principle in my heart of love rather than morality. And that might be something people might want to just have a think about when it comes to the cultures coming together. You have, as Tim was saying so articulately, can we have a loving conversation rather than a moral conversation? So is it about drums and guitars in church, or is it about sitting down and saying, what are you trying to achieve with drums and guitars? Because I remember at Guymer Anglican, it was mid-80s before we had guitars and drums in the church, because some of our elders thought that was satanic to have syncopation in church. That's a very old conversation that's not being discussed these days. It would have been easy for my generation just to say, oh, it's too hard to have that conversation, we're just going to leave and start our own church with guitars and drums. But we didn't. We persevered, and we stayed there, and we had that conversation. And I'm so glad we did, because there was so much relational benefit from having the ages come together. And even though I did disagree with their point of view about guitars and drums, they ended up being humble, like Tim was saying, and changed their mind, which was really lovely. And I learnt so much more. And in fact, the story I told you about the relationship I had with Aboriginal people, it was one of my elders that I listened to who said, you need to care more about the whole world and the whole of the Christian church, not just your little youth group in your church. So if I'd have gone off with my little youth group and started a church, I might have just stayed with those blinkers on for the rest of my life. But because I persevered and I had that conversation with Alf Norman, we got in the car one day and he drove me out to Moree so we could meet some Aboriginal Christians, and we became really good friends. And then I ended up cutting my hair and changing too. So I think that's the gospel, that we love each other and we submit to one another in love, as it says in Ephesians 5.
I was just thinking of a more recent example. A couple of years ago, we were talking about the new high-rise apartments that we've got across the road from our church. And the Sutherland Shire, where we are, is typically quite a white Anglo area, beachside suburb, and so a lot of that culture permeates our church and our suburbs. But with the new high-rise coming in, we've got a number of people from Asian backgrounds who are moving into not just our suburb, but directly across the road from us.
It's exciting.
And we had our sister Grace was a student minister at the time, and she's from Asian descent, and we asked her, how can we continue to accommodate the way that we do church in ways that will be appropriate and accessible to our new neighbours across the road. And one of the things she pointed out was actually there's a number of times when people have stood up to preach wearing shorts. And typically, she said, for people of my cultural background, if we walk into a church and the preacher or the leader is not wearing long pants, there's no way we're going to be able to take them seriously. And so that was something that we then talked about as a preaching team, was, okay, well, it's a small thing. I mean, it's not circumcision, it's not even cutting your hair. It's just make sure you put on pants and not shorts if you're going to be leading the service or preaching. And that way, it's just a small little accommodation to say that when we do have our neighbours come in, that they won't just look at us and think, oh, well, this person's a joke. Why would I take what they're saying seriously? Actually, there's just a little bit of respect. We've crossed that communication barrier, and so they can hear the gospel, so they can actually understand who Jesus is and what he's done for them.
And we've changed a little bit as a result. And then all of a sudden, Grace and her sister Michelle and Ian and Wang and Louisa have started another soul revival community in the West Ryde area. And that's growing beautifully with a lot of people from Asian background. And I think you're right. I think it's the love principle that's operating there rather than let's start a church for people with Asian culture and Anglo culture. Let's be one church. And so having all those guys at West Ryde on our parish council and on our core group has been really helpful because we've grown and changed as well. So I think that's the exciting thing about staying together rather as much and as long as you can, rather than necessarily saying, well, because there's a cultural difference, we have to start a new church. I think you can stick around a bit longer than that.
Yeah, I think something that I'm picking up from what you guys are saying is that Jesus is the great equalizer. We talk all the time that he doesn't only reconcile us to God, he reconciles us to each other. So that means that we can, as you're talking about, approach these differences in love because Jesus allows us to do that. So that's what and approaching in love allows us to listen as well. And that's what I've really got from you guys today. So I really appreciate taking the time and enlightening me as well as our listeners. So thank you very much. That wraps it up for this episode though. And thank you very much for listening, guys. We appreciate it. If you've got any questions or comments, you can email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. We're also on a Discord server, which is you can have a chat on, and we'll be monitoring that for sure. If you ever want to ask a question on that, that's in the show notes as well. And if you're interested, you can check out all our other stuff on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app, including the Chip Lunch podcast, where we talk about growing up as a Christian. Tim, you've been on that. Stu, I think we'll have to get you on that one day too.
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be cool. But anyway, we'll wrap it up now and say thank you very much for listening, and one way.
One way.